Hi, I'm Marcus Weaver Hightower. I'm a professor at the University of North Dakota. I want to talk to you a little bit today about levels of language analysis, and this is particularly important in discourse analysis because discourse encompasses a lot of linguistic information. And of course, discourse analysis is not only about looking at linguistics, but there is a certain component of it that's important to understand. So if we look at the levels of language, the first level that a linguist might talk about is phonology, and that is the sounds that are possible in a particular language. Now, of course, some languages have sounds that others don't. So I'm going to show you an example here of Zulu.
Okay. Uma niqala uhambo lwenu ningalenzi iphutha nidlule la kaZulu Natal usuke ungaqede lutho uma ungakazi nje udlule kwaZulu Natal yona ndawo yokuqala ke okufanele udlule kuyona ngiyakutshena wena khala iqhude kuselulizwe lenze ngiyakelekile.
Thank you.
Thamsanqa Ndlovu lo okhulumayo.
Now you'll notice that in that sample of Zulu language where that Zulu speaker was welcoming us to KwaZulu-Natal, which is a province in South Africa, you'll have noticed a lot of clicks coming. And actually in Zulu, there are a lot of other sorts of sounds that speakers can use in the back of their throat, a sort of a vibratory kind of sound that speakers of English can't do or don't do when producing the particular sounds of their language. Now, of course, in all languages, speakers make choices about how these particular sounds are used, and that can encompass things like dialect, accents, all those sorts of things. So when we think about doing discourse analysis, part of what we're thinking about is how people are making choices in terms of phonology. The next part is morphology, and that's how words and meaningful word parts are constructed in a particular language. So we can have, for instance, word parts that are things like prefixes or affixes. So unionism in English has one particular meaning. If we add on a prefix like anti-unionism, that completely changes the entire way that the word is put together, and there's lots of more nuanced ways that we can actually put words together as well. But especially when we're talking about discourse analysis, phonology and morphology, we think about things like pronunciation, we think about things like intonation, we think about things like rhythm, and particularly oftentimes discourse analysts will be interested in things like word stress and prominence. So how the actual sound of the word is used within a sentence. So things like going up at the end of the sentence, that can make the grammatical change of making something into a sentence just by having a word stressed. Attitude can be done by word stress and prominence. And also interaction between people can be handled in particular ways by word stress and prominence. Also, we're often interested in how word forms are used. So for word forms like making a verb into a noun can be a kind of common morphological process in business discourse, for example. Syntax is the next level of language that we're interested in as discourse analysts, and that's how sentences are constructed in a particular language. So take, for instance, a phrase like to carefully read. Now, you can say this quite understandably in English, so you could have a teacher saying, make sure to carefully read your homework so that you'll be ready for the test. Now, of course, traditional grammarians would say that that is actually a mistake. That's what we would call a split infinitive. In English, we have these infinitives. It's to plus a verb, and oftentimes we can use those infinitives in a sentence, and we would normally say in traditional grammar not to put an adverb or an adjective in between those. But, as I say, you can actually do it and make a lot of sense. In a different language like German, right, the same kind of phrase would be aufmerksam lesen. So to read carefully, and lesen is basically the equivalent in English to read. But you can't split the word lesen as you can in English. You couldn't say le aufmerksam sein. I mean, to split le and sen just doesn't make any sense. It's just random sounds that somebody would be making. It wouldn't actually put together an actual sentence. The bottom line, again, is that the choices that we make in syntax can say a lot about the discourse activities that are going on. We can split infinitives in English and make a lot of sense, but if you are a traditional grammarian, as I say, like you think of your 4th grade English teacher who always took off points for splitting infinitives in your writing, that's a certain identity that's being created. It's not actually something that's bound within the language. There's discourse that's going on that either makes that appropriate or not. The next thing that we'll think about is semantics. And that's how meaning is made in a particular language. And of course, words can have lots of different meanings beyond just their sort of denotative meaning. In other words, the meaning that you would see just in a dictionary. So take, for example, a word like stuff. Often we'd think of this as having a very specific, understandable meaning. Probably when you see the word stuff, you think of one particular meaning right off the bat. But that meaning is not actually clearly residing in the word itself. The other linguistic choices that we're making around a word can often determine what the meaning of it is. So if you take a look at stuff and all the different meanings that it can be a noun, it can be a verb, or it can be an adjective when we just add the affix ed. So think in terms of the noun, like I've got too much stuff. So it's this notion of stuff being possessions. Or a verb form like stuff the turkey before you bake it. So you're actually shoving something into something else. Or an adjective, stuffed peppers, right? The peppers have been treated to that verb that we just talked about, having something shoved into them. Another noun form, however, is something like iron is tough stuff. Stuff in this case meaning a material, right? So it's no longer just possessions, but it's materials. You could have a different verb. So in the United Kingdom, for instance, if you say get stuffed, that has a rather crude meaning. Or if you look at those adjective forms, so in the original adjective form, we looked at stuffed peppers being delicious, something's been shoved into them. We might have a sentence like stuffed animals are cute on a toddler's bed, so the animals in this case are stuffed, meaning they're stuffed with cotton. But if you look at the next one, stuffed dogs, that is a stuffed animal, but it's a different kind of stuffed animal. Stuffed dogs seem creepy to me, so that in that case we're talking about taxidermy, right? So a lot of what we do with meaning of the word stuff, and there's lots more choices that you can make about stuff, a lot of the meaning is coming from having the other parts of the sentence around it. So how that meaning is created is dependent on other things. And then we've got pragmatics. And pragmatics is how meanings in a language are determined by context. So for semantics, a lot of the meaning of a word is coming from the linguistic information that's around that particular word. But in pragmatics, these are things that are what we might think of as extra linguistics. It lies outside of the actual words and language being used. It's the context that's determining what the language means. So here's some examples. If we had a sentence like, hold on to your hats, Jane is driving, right? You might literally mean that people should hold on to their hats, but probably that's more metaphorical. But the real key here is that there's information being implied that's not actually stated, right? So hold on to your hats, Jane is driving, probably means something like Jane is a fast or perhaps wild driver, but that's not actually being said here. It's being implied. So there's something outside of the linguistics that's making meaning of this particular sentence. Or take these two different sentences. I apologize for stepping on your toe versus Karen apologized for stepping on Jim's toe. One of those is actually doing something, what we would call an apology. The other is actually describing something. So even though there's this notion of apology within there, one is actually doing something in the world and one is just describing something in the world. Or take a situation like this. These three people standing together. This person in the middle says, I now pronounce you man and wife, versus if you have this gentleman on the right talking to these other two children saying, I now pronounce you man and wife. One of these situations is actually going to produce a kind of legal bond. The other is just what we might call play, right? So, and it all depends on the people involved, right? One person in these two situations actually has the power of the state to be able to say that two people are married. The other person could say it all he wants to, and he would never actually marry somebody in a legal sense. Next, somebody might ask you, do you have the time? An appropriate response would be 4:30, right? They actually want the time. So, but if somebody took the question, do you have the time, and said yes, that's not an appropriate response. So what the person is actually asking is not, do you have the time, but would you please give me the time? So the linguistic actual production of language is not matching up with what the actual meaning is supposed to be. And of course, if you had a conversation like discourse analysis is cool, and then somebody replied, you can say that again. If they said discourse analysis is cool again, that's not really an appropriate response. Speakers don't always say what they mean. So when the respondent said, you can say that again, he or she didn't really mean say it again. What they meant was to sort of emphasize, yes, I agree. So the big question comes then, so where does discourse fit into all these levels of language, from phonology to morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics? Well, in some ways, discourse in a linguistic sense is language use beyond the individual sentence. Now again, when we talk about discourse analysis, we're not only talking about the linguistic sense, but it does have a linguistic sense in addition to more theoretical, sociological kinds of senses. And in this case, it's language use beyond the individual sentence. So if we try to think about that diagrammatically, phonology is the smallest parts of language, just sounds. Morphology is when you combine those sounds together to actually produce words or word parts, meaningful word parts. Then syntax is how you put those words together into sentences. Semantics looks at how those sentences make meaning internally, linguistically. Pragmatics then is how the context around what's going on in the sentences is actually producing meaning. And then discourse is going to look at all of those. It encompasses all of those various features. So when we do discourse analysis from a linguistic point of view, we are looking at all of those various levels of language. And any discourse analysis can actually take a look at those particular levels of language. So thanks for tuning in today, and hopefully as you go forward, you'll have a better sense of what kinds of things you can look for in a linguistic part of discourse analysis.